a whisper in the chimney. But who left it behind? Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. Tell me, where are you joining from tonight? Your voices make this mystery unforgettable. Let's begin. It was the sort of afternoon that seemed designed by Providence for a village tea. The sun filtered gently through the gauzy clouds, dappling the manicured lawn of Mrs. Caroline Pembury's garden in Larkspur Lane. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, their pale heads bobbing politely in the breeze, and the silver tea service, polished to within an inch of its life, gleamed in the dappled light. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Brinton, remarked that it was just the sort of day that reminds one how lucky we are not to live in the city, which prompted polite murmurs of agreement from the assembled ladies. Among them sat Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, demure in lavender lace and sipping her tea with such quiet absorption that she might have been entirely forgotten. Caroline Pembury, a widow of comfortable means and boundless energy, was holding court near the trellised rose arch, recounting a mildly shocking tale about the new chemist's assistant in Much Benham. "It's his sideburns," she said with crisp finality. "They remind me of a man I once saw outside a music hall in Brighton. Utterly unsuitable." The laughter was interrupted, subtly at first as though nature itself had paused. Then came the sound, a voice, thin, reedy, almost childlike, echoing faintly down the chimney stack of the Pembury residence. Everyone froze. The fireplace, an ornate, if out-of-season relic at the far end of the drawing-room, had until then been entirely unremarkable. But now the voice issued from it again, stronger this time. "Let me out. For God's sake, someone help me." The teacups trembled on their saucers. Mrs. Brinton let out a gasp. One of the younger ladies, Edith Swallow, barely out of her finishing school, screamed outright. Miss Marple did not scream. She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of profound and curious stillness. Mrs. Pembury, pale beneath her rouge, rose stiffly. That must be children, playing some wretched trick. But no child's voice ever carried such genuine panic. Within minutes, the drawing-room had filled with a confused babble of voices and the clatter of hastily moved furniture. Mr. Elston, the Pembury's gardener, was summoned and, grumbling and bewildered, dispatched to check the roof. It was he who found the body. Wedged halfway down the chimney shaft, head first, limbs rigid and long past saving. By the time the local constable arrived, a hush had fallen over Larkspur Lane. The birds had resumed their chirping. The teacups remained abandoned on their saucers. Cooling in the summer air, Miss Marple asked only one question, so softly that few noticed she'd spoken at all. Did anyone happen to hear the voice again, after the body was removed? No one had. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, her eyes on the fireplace as if it might offer her a reply. The village of St. Mary Mead was, by and large, a community of rational minds and sensible habits, more inclined to fuss over missing marmalade jars or new lace curtains than dead bodies lodged in chimneys. But by the morning after the garden tea at Larkspur Lane, reason had been routed entirely, and speculation spread like jam on a hot scone. By 9 o'clock, Mrs. Brinton had already relayed the story twice to the milkman and to Miss Harmonsworth, the spinster who taught piano out of her parlour on Gossamer Road. She reported, with only the smallest embellishment, that the corpse had spoken after death and possibly foretold its own murder. Edith Swallow, for her part, told her mother it had been a ghost in the chimney and promptly fainted again before breakfast. And at the grocer's, one could not approach the tea tins without overhearing an argument about whether the dead man had climbed in on his own, been forced or dropped down from a dirigible. Miss Marple said very little. She took her customary walk to the post office that morning, pausing to observe how the gardenias in Mrs. Banfield's window had begun to wilt. An oddity, since Mrs. Banfield was meticulous about her watering schedule. She then returned to her sitting room, where she arranged her embroidery beside her, as if she might pick it up at any moment, though she never did. Instead, she sat quite still, eyes fixed on the tiny ticking clock on the mantelpiece, waiting, not idly, but patiently. She was not disappointed. Before noon, there came a knock at the door, followed by a tentative voice. "Miss Marple, I do beg your pardon. May I come in?" It was Constable Roger Sims, red in the face and visibly flustered beneath his helmet. A decent young man, if a little green. Miss Marple welcomed him with her usual gentle courtesy, offered tea, which he declined, and settled back in her armchair, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I don't mean to intrude," Sims began, "but it's this business at Larkspur Lane. Colonel Melchett sent for the inspector from the county, and he's due this afternoon. But in the meantime, well, seeing as you were there, and have a certain reputation for observing things," he trailed off. Miss Marple offered a kindly nod of encouragement. "Anything you could tell us, ma'am," he said, almost sheepishly. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. It was rather peculiar, wasn't it? A man's voice calling down the chimney, quite unlike any prank or childish mischief. It seemed very real, very urgent. "Yes," Sims said, shifting. "Only the coroner believes the man had been dead at least 8 hours by the time we found him." 8 hours? Miss Marple repeated softly. He nodded. "Likely sometime during the night. Which means—" The voice— He hesitated, embarrassed to say it aloud. "Must have been someone else entirely," Miss Marple finished for him, her tone mild, but with a certain glint behind her spectacles. "Perhaps someone who knew the body would be discovered. Who wanted to draw attention to it, or away from something else." Sims looked at her, startled. "You think someone was pretending to be the victim? Speaking into the chimney to mislead everyone?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that people rarely cry for help unless there's someone close enough to hear. And I think we should consider why the discovery happened when it did, not simply that it happened at all." Sims jotted this down, though he looked perplexed. "And the victim?" she asked. He cleared his throat. "Young man, not from the village. No identification on him, but plain clothes. Rough hands. Builder or chimney sweep, maybe. They've sent his fingerprints to the county." Miss Marple's brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "And no one recognized him?" Sims shook his head. "No one who was at the party, ma'am, or nearby. At least not so far as we've been told." Miss Marple pressed her lips together. "I wonder," she murmured. "Would you mind terribly if I took a short walk?" He blinked. "Walk, ma'am?" "Yes," she said, rising. "I'd like to have a look at the Pembury house again. Particularly the chimney. Not to climb it, of course," she added with a tiny smile, "but it might be enlightening to view it from the garden once more." Sims, still not quite sure what he had asked for in coming here, found himself escorting her down Larkspur Lane once again, hat in hand. At the Pembury house, the garden looked almost identical to how it had the day before, though the table had been cleared and the chairs pushed haphazardly under the arbor. The roses still bloomed, as though nothing untoward had occurred beneath their pink petals. Miss Marple stood, hands clasped, gazing up at the chimney. It was tall, taller than most, set in the gable wall, and part of the original Georgian structure of the house. Wide enough certainly for a body, but she was not looking at the opening itself. Her eyes were on the ivy growing along the side wall. "You see," she said mildly, "I do not believe anyone fell in." Sims followed her gaze and frowned. "You think he climbed? Or was placed? But either way, if someone wanted to conceal a body, there are quieter places than a chimney. People light fires." Sims looked troubled. "Unless they wanted it found." "They wanted it found." "Quite. Or unless it had already been found by someone else, who then staged the discovery to create confusion." She stepped forward, examining the base of the wall, the garden stones, the earth. Nothing disturbed. She bent slightly, touching a small indentation in the soil. A scuff mark, shallow but distinct, where a heel had slipped and pressed into the ground. Recent, possibly made during the frenzied activity the day before. "Possibly not. Is Mrs. Pembury at home?" she asked. "She's resting, I believe," Sims said. "Doctor gave her something to calm her nerves. It was quite a shock." "Understandable," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she know the man?" "Claims she's never seen him." Miss Marple straightened. "Ah," she said. "Claims." The inspector arrived shortly after they returned to the gate, a brisk, no-nonsense man with a moustache like a yard broom and a voice loud enough to part hedges. He greeted Miss Marple politely but without enthusiasm, and took Sims aside to ask after the chimney measurements and medical examiner's report. Miss Marple, no longer required, began walking home. She took a slightly longer route, looping past the back lane that bordered the edge of the Pembury property. A wooden gate sat crooked on its hinges, leading to an overgrown shed once used, she recalled, for curing bacon. Mrs. Pembury had mentioned as much at a WI meeting years ago. Miss Marple paused. The grass beyond the gate had been trodden recently. A path, faint but present, wound from the gate to the back hedge and around the corner of the house. She noted the path, and she noted something else too. A faint trace of soot on a bent branch that grazed the guttering. Not much, but enough. Back in her own parlour, Miss Marple made tea. She took only one sip before placing the cup aside and retrieving her address book. One name she underlined with a delicate tap of her pencil: Mrs. Cynthia Prowse. Miss Prowse had been at the tea. A cousin of Mrs. Pembury's, come to stay for the summer. She had arrived late, Miss Marple recalled, flustered and apologetic, claiming she had taken a wrong turn during a walk. Miss Marple had not thought much of it then. But now she did. Because Miss Prowse, though slight and sweet-tempered, had one habit that struck Miss Marple as deeply out of character. She never drank tea, and in St. Mary Mead, that was the sort of detail that meant something. It was not at all unusual, in St. Mary Mead, for people to come and go quietly over the summer months, visiting cousins, distant aunts, sometimes even vague acquaintances, invited under the wide umbrella of needing a change of air. The arrival of Mrs. Cynthia Prowse, cousin to Caroline Pembury, and a widow of respectable obscurity, had made no great ripple when it occurred 2 weeks prior to the garden tea. She had been described as delicate and quiet, with thinning fair hair arranged into a permanent nest of pins, and the gentle, uncertain manner of one who was always trying not to disturb the room she was in. She wore sensible cardigans, avoided strong perfume, and gave the impression of someone who folded every garment before bed. She was, in short, exactly the sort of woman who vanished into a crowd of St. Mary Mead matrons without the faintest outline of suspicion. And yet, Miss Marple had noticed her, not for anything she said, but for something she didn't. On the day of the tea at Larkspur Lane, while the rest of the guests drank copious quantities of Assam and Darjeeling, Miss Prowse had declined not only tea, but coffee, cordial, and lemonade as well. She accepted only a glass of water, and even that with visible reluctance. Now, there were many reasons for such abstinence: digestive trouble, religious conviction, or the influence of a fashionable health cure. But it was not the abstinence itself that struck Miss Marple. It was what Miss Prowse did with her glass of water. She held it, carefully, precisely, for nearly half an hour without sipping. She had smiled and nodded, and murmured through the chatter of others, her hand wrapped around the unchanging level of water in the glass. Miss Marple, who had seen parishioners fake an appetite to be polite, and had once watched a poisoner cleverly never eat her own jam tart, had noted it, and remembered. By mid-afternoon, the village was alive with two simultaneous movements: the official inquiry, orchestrated by Inspector Craddock and his team, and the social inquiry, being conducted over fences, at shop counters, and by the vicar's wife, whose natural talent for gentle prying was given new scope by tragedy. Meanwhile, Miss Marple baked a seed cake. It was a reliable way to produce visitors, particularly of the curious sort. And sure enough, within 20 minutes of its scent wafting from the front window, her parlour was graced by none other than Caroline Pembury herself. Red-eyed, powdered a shade too pale, and visibly eager to talk. "I hardly slept," Caroline said, accepting a slice. "Not a wink, Jane. The image of that man, poor soul, lodged up there like some dreadful jack-in-the-box. And the voice, I'll hear it in my nightmares. Do you think it could have been some sort of premonition?" "I think," said Miss Marple calmly, "that it is often helpful to consider who benefits from confusion." The voice caused quite a stir, didn't it? Caroline waved her hand dismissively. "Well, anyone would be startled. But if you're suggesting someone intended that fright—" "Though really, Jane, who on earth would do such a ghastly thing?" "That is what we must consider. That someone did. And had reason." Caroline hesitated. "Do you think he was trying to rob the house?" "No," said Miss Marple, "I do not." "Then what?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Did your cousin Cynthia know any young men in London?" Caroline blinked. "Cynthia? Good gracious, I doubt it. She's hardly the type. Poor dear has lived in her memories since her husband passed, and she's always been shy. Pathologically so, really." "Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular," Miss Marple said airily. "Only I noticed she seemed rather tired yesterday." "Was she out walking again?" Caroline's brow furrowed. Yes, I believe she went toward Old Mill Lane. She said she enjoys being near water. There's a stream along that path. I don't see what— She broke off, squinting. You don't think she had anything to do with it? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I think, Caroline, that women, particularly quiet ones, are often underestimated. And that one mustn't dismiss people simply because they seem inconsequential. Caroline, clearly alarmed, set down her teacup. Well, I do hope you're wrong. I'd hate for anything to disturb Cynthia. She's been so fragile, so devoted to dear George's memory. Miss Marple, who knew from long experience that people rarely lived entirely in the shadow of memory, only nodded and offered more cake. The next morning brought news that the police had identified the victim. His name was Victor Lonsdale, 29 years old, a travelling decorator and occasional odd-job man last employed in Oxfordshire, with no known family nearby. He had spent the previous week in the vicinity of Much Benham, taking on painting work for a country inn, and, according to his employer, had received a mysterious telegram the day before his death, after which he abruptly packed his things and left. No one knew where he had gone. Until now, Miss Marple, learning this from young Sims, asked to see the telegram. It had been destroyed, the innkeeper said. Tossed into the fire after Victor had read it aloud and declared he had an urgent matter to settle in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's knitting needle paused mid-stitch. That night, Miss Marple paid a social call on Mrs. Cynthia Prowse. It was not a long visit. Miss Marple admired the carnations in the drawing-room, accepted a biscuit, and made pleasant conversation about the town's recent flower show. But she noted, casually kindly, that Cynthia's hands trembled faintly when she poured the tea, and that her eyes darted just slightly when the chimney was mentioned. I suppose, Miss Marple said, gazing at the fire grate, it's a strange place to end up, the chimney. One doesn't often think of it as deliberate. More a place to hide something, like a secret, or to trap it. Mrs. Prowse's teacup rattled in its saucer. But then, Miss Marple went on, if one were trying to dispose of something quietly, one wouldn't call attention to it with a voice, would one? I don't know what you mean, Cynthia stammered. No, said Miss Marple, of course not. Though it must have been dreadful, receiving that telegram from Victor. Cynthia froze. I beg your pardon, she whispered. You did know him, didn't you? Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. From before. Perhaps quite well, perhaps even before your husband passed. And then, years later, he turns up again. You'd written him, or perhaps he wrote you first. Promises, regrets, something rekindled. He said he'd changed, she said in a rush. That he'd find work. That we could be together. But he didn't want to wait. He wanted to tell Caroline. He said I owed her the truth. That we had known each other long before George and I ever met. And perhaps you feared what Caroline would think, Miss Marple said softly, or what she might do. Perhaps you tried to reason with him. Perhaps there was a quarrel. Cynthia's face crumpled. I only wanted him to leave, she said. I said I'd think about it. He got angry. He said he'd come that afternoon and tell Caroline everything. So I told him to wait, that I'd meet him. I thought I could calm him. But he was so angry. He said he'd climb into the chimney if I didn't let him in, make a dramatic scene. And then he slipped. He was drunk. He thought it would be romantic. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I panicked, she said. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let him be found like that. So I pretended, I called out during the party. I made it sound like someone trapped. So they'd find him and think it was some stranger. I didn't kill him. I didn't. Miss Marple nodded slowly. No, she said, but you didn't save him. Either. Cynthia began to sob, and Miss Marple quietly pressed the bell for the maid and asked her to fetch Constable Sims. It was never dramatic with Miss Marple. There were no cries of "I knew it" or vindictive satisfaction in exposing a guilty party. When Constable Sims arrived at the Pembury residence that evening, summoned by a composed and gently apologetic Miss Marple, he found Cynthia Prowse pale, exhausted, and unresisting. The confession had taken everything from her, more perhaps than even the hidden relationship with Victor Lonsdale ever had. Sims, unused to the delicate shades of such cases, looked from Cynthia to Miss Marple with something close to panic. But she didn't kill him, did she? He whispered, while Cynthia sobbed softly in the next room. It's not Murder? Miss Marple shook her head. No, I believe it's what the law might call criminal neglect. She did not cause his death, but she ensured it would be found in a way that obscured the truth. And in doing so, she misled the investigation, withheld evidence, and, most tragically, chose fear over responsibility. Sims swallowed. Still, not murder. No, said Miss Marple, not unkindly. But not innocence either. Colonel Melchett arrived at the Pembury home not long after, flushed and impatient, and immediately began barking about formal charges, depositions, and inspectors. But Miss Marple had already slipped away. She had no interest in watching the machinery of law creak into motion. Her concern always was not the gears, but the people who got caught between them. The next day dawned dull and grey, a mist hanging low over the hedgerows, as if the village itself were reluctant to wake after the shock of the last 48 hours. At the butcher's, conversation turned to the quality of sausages again. At the greengrocer's, the latest gossip concerned whether Mrs. Armitage's gooseberries had gone sour because of the weather or her new maid's rough handling. But beneath the chatter ran an undercurrent of unease, as though no one quite trusted the village's peaceful face anymore. Miss Marple sat alone at breakfast, her porridge cooling as she read and reread the telegram's contents, which Constable Sims had finally unearthed from the innkeeper's recollection. Coming to you. Expect news, see, it was brief, but damning. Cynthia had sent it, no doubt in a moment of romantic weakness. She had hoped, perhaps, to revive something that had never quite existed. Miss Marple had seen such hopes before, hanging like tattered lace in the hearts of women who had lived too long under the weight of someone else's expectations. And yet, something still bothered her. Victor Lonsdale had climbed down the chimney, or tried to, knowing there was a gathering in progress. He had chosen a time when the house was full of people. If he were desperate to see Cynthia, would he not have waited for a quiet moment? Would he not have tried the back door again or sent another note? And then there was the matter of his past. Though Cynthia had painted a picture of a man reformed, the report from Inspector Craddock told another story, a history of petty thefts, 2 dismissed charges for breaking and entering, and a reputation for vanishing between jobs. Why come back now? Why here? Miss Marple, sipping her now cold tea, considered. If Victor had been looking to restart a romance, there were easier ways. But if he had come to threaten Cynthia, perhaps to blackmail her, or worse, then his sudden and dramatic appearance at the chimney made more sense. And if Cynthia had not killed him, someone else might have tried. That thought clung to her like mist in the hedgerows. She rose and fetched her gardening gloves. A visit to Larkspur Lane was in order, not to revisit the chimney, but to speak with the housekeeper, Mrs. Dash. Mrs. Dash was a large, practical woman with a soft spot for marmalade and a sharper mind than her quiet manner suggested. She had worked for the Pemburys for years, even before Caroline's husband passed away, and kept the household running with a calm efficiency that never wavered. Not even when a body fell down the chimney. I can't imagine poor Miss Cynthia did anything criminal, she said, pouring tea into thick china mugs. Though she did seem distracted lately, like someone waiting for bad news. Did she receive any visitors before the day of the tea? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Dash considered. Not that I saw. But I do recall she went out several times late in the afternoon. Once she came back with her scarf in a terrible knot and dirt on her cuffs. Said she'd lost her way in the woods. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The woods near Old Mill Lane? That's the place. Did she say whether she met anyone there? No, said Mrs. Dash, shaking her head. But she was pale as a boiled egg when she returned. Miss Marple thanked her and left shortly after, but she didn't return home immediately. Instead, she took the path behind the Pembury house, skirting the hedgerow, and entered the woods near Old Mill Lane. It was quieter here, still damp from the morning dew. Miss Marple walked slowly, her keen eyes scanning the moss and twigs. She was not sure what she hoped to find, but something told her Victor had not come here just for love. He had come to collect on something. About 20 minutes into the woods, just past a fallen birch, she found what she didn't know she was looking for, the remains of a small fire, charcoal, faint soot, a crumpled corner of scorched newspaper, and something glinting beneath a log. She bent, using her umbrella to nudge it free. It was a watch. A man's watch. Cracked face. The time stopped at 4:17. She turned it over. On the back was a barely legible inscription, "To R.G. with regret." Miss Marple stood very still. R.G., not Cynthia. Someone else had been involved, someone who had known Victor before, someone he had once given a gift to. With regret. She slipped the watch into her pocket. Back in the village, she stopped at the vicarage. The vicar's wife was out, but the vicar himself, Reverend Chiswell, was home and pleased to see her. "Jane, come in. You look as if you've had a revelation." "I may have," Miss Marple said lightly. "Tell me, Reverend, do you recall anyone named R.G. in the village?" He furrowed his brow. R.G. I believe the surname starts with a G. Perhaps someone who's returned to St. Mary Mead recently." Reverend Chiswell snapped his fingers. "Ah, Raymond Gillyflower. Came back from the colonies, maybe a month ago, staying with his sister on Chapel Row. Used to be quite wild in his youth. I believe he worked overseas, railroads in Africa or some such." Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. "And his sister?" "Miss Nora Gillyflower. Odd woman, rarely speaks to anyone, keeps to herself. Would she have known Caroline Pembury? They grew up here together, but I believe there was a falling out some years ago. Something about a gentleman caller, though no one ever said who." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I dare say I can guess." And as she walked home again, the pieces began to settle into place, not neatly, but with the inevitable logic of human nature. Cynthia had not lied exactly, but she had not been the only one with a past. Someone else had feared Victor Lonsdale's return, someone with far more to lose than Cynthia Prowse, and someone who had taken steps, quietly, ruthlessly, to ensure Victor never left St. Mary Mead again. By the following morning, the clouds had cleared and left St. Mary Mead in a crisp, sunlit hush, as if the weather itself were attempting to tidy away the residue of recent revelations. Yet behind curtained windows and over neatly trimmed hedges, the village remained deeply unsettled. Cynthia Prowse was not in custody, not formally. Though Inspector Craddock had made it clear she was not to travel, she had taken to her room and, according to Caroline Pembury, was doing very little but cry. Miss Marple had no intention of speaking to Cynthia again. Not yet. Cynthia had told her version of the story. Now it was time to hear the other version, the one not offered freely, the one that always took a little digging, a little watching, and just enough pressure to reveal itself. She dressed in her most neutral ensemble, a dove-grey cardigan over a starch-white blouse, and set out for Chapel Row. Miss Nora Gillyflower's house sat at the very edge of the village, just before the fields rolled down toward the railway track. It was a modest brick cottage with whitewashed sills and a lopsided rose trellis climbing its front. The garden was neat, almost aggressively so. Clipped hedges, swept paths, and not a leaf out of place. It bore all the hallmarks of someone trying to keep control of something. Miss Marple had long known that a ruthless garden was often the sign of a restless conscience. Nora herself answered the door. She was about Miss Marple's age, though considerably more angular in feature and temperament. Her hair was still a fierce chestnut, plainly dyed, and she wore a long buttoned-up brown dress that seemed more suited to a schoolmistress than a retiree. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice guarded. "I didn't expect a morning walk," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "And I do so enjoy seeing how people manage their roses. Yours are impeccable, Miss Gillyflower, though I dare say you have help now with your brother staying." Nora's face flickered almost imperceptibly. "Raymond doesn't garden. He prefers to keep to his books. Yes, of course, the returning scholar." "I wouldn't say scholar," Nora replied. "He's resting. After years abroad, one needs a quiet corner of the world to regain one's peace." "How true," said Miss Marple with a small nod. "And such peace St. Mary Mead offers, unless, of course, one is found lodged in a chimney." That did it. The flicker of unease in Nora's expression deepened. "A terrible business," she said too quickly, quite beyond belief. "I imagine it was even more surprising for your brother. To come back to a village he hadn't seen in 20 years, and then to find himself in the midst of a mystery." "I don't believe he knew the man," Nora said shortly. Miss Marple smiled. "I never said he did." There was a silence. Miss Marple continued, "It's a curious thing, you know, how the past comes back when we least expect it, old feelings, old mistakes, sometimes even old lovers. One rarely prepares for it properly. Nora's lips tightened. If you've come to suggest— Oh, not at all, dear, Miss Marple said, her tone like warm tea. I simply noticed years ago that there was some tension between you and Caroline Pembury. It seemed unfinished. Nora stepped back. I think you should go. But Miss Marple did not move. Just one question, she said mildly. Did your brother ever own a silver watch with the inscription, "To RG with regret V"? The silence snapped tight between them. Then, in a voice thin as thread, Nora said, It was stolen. Years ago. Raymond said it was gone. He never said how. I believe Victor Lonsdale gave it to him. I found it in the woods near a fire that had only recently burned out. The same woods where Cynthia Prowse claimed to have gone walking the night Victor died. A long pause. Then Nora exhaled, her posture crumpling by degrees. He said Victor turned up a few days before the tea, that he'd been in touch, wanted money, threatened to tell everyone something dreadful if Raymond didn't pay. And did Raymond give him money? He said he would, but I don't believe he meant to. I think he wanted to scare him off. Did Raymond ever say what the threat was? Nora shook her head. Only that it would ruin everything. That if Victor spoke, there would be no forgiveness left, for anyone. Miss Marple's voice softened. Did Raymond leave the house the night before the garden party? Nora was quiet for a long time. Yes, she said at last. He left after supper, said he was going for a walk to clear his head, but he was gone for hours. He came back with mud on his shoes and asked for a fire in the grate, said he was cold. In June, and he never asked for a fire, not once since he came home. Miss Marple felt the last piece settle into place. She walked home alone, deep in thought. Raymond Gillyflower had motive. Victor Lonsdale had clearly threatened exposure. The old watch, discarded near the remains of a secret meeting, was likely thrown into the fire and forgotten. But the fire hadn't quite consumed it. It would not take much. A confrontation in the woods. A struggle. Perhaps Victor, bold and theatrical, threatening to make a scene at the Pembury party. Raymond, always more brittle than brave, striking in fear or anger. Then the body inconveniently intact, and the chimney, a hiding place within view, almost a metaphor. Concealment inside the very hearth of a home. But what Raymond had not expected was Cynthia. She too had reason to meet Victor, had hoped perhaps to steal a moment of romance back from the edge of middle age. Instead, she found him already dead, or nearly so, and she panicked. So she created the voice, a plea from the chimney, a cry for help. Enough to make the death seem accidental, a prank gone wrong. She thought she was covering her shame. She never guessed she was also covering Raymond's crime. By the next morning, Miss Marple had written 3 neatly phrased notes, one to Inspector Craddock, summarizing her observations, one to the coroner's office requesting the official timeline of Victor's cause of death, and one, far more delicate, to Nora Gillyflower. That last note asked only for a private word. It was Nora who came to her, alone. Miss Marple met her at the edge of the churchyard, where the ancient yew trees cast long shadows. Will he confess? She asked softly. No, Miss Marple said. I don't believe he will, but I think in time the pressure will tell. Men like Raymond don't carry guilt well. They fester, and when they fester, they talk. First to themselves, then aloud, eventually to the right ear. Nora looked away, her eyes brimming. He didn't mean to kill him. He didn't mean to kill him. No, Miss Marple agreed. But Victor's death began long before the blow was struck. It began the moment Raymond believed the truth of his past was a threat instead of a warning. There was nothing more to say. Miss Marple turned back toward the village, her step steady, her hands folded gently together. Another tragedy folded and filed away. Another truth revealed, not through grand deductions or laboratory evidence, but through kindness, observation, and the quiet understanding of what people do when they are afraid of being seen. And at her window, that evening, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly as peace settled, at least for now, over St. Mary Mead once again. Miss Marple was not one to leave threads dangling, be they of yarn or of narrative. And although peace had returned to the village in outward appearance, there remained something about the affair of Victor Lonsdale's death that did not yet sit comfortably in her mind. Cynthia Prowse remained indoors, and Miss Marple, with her delicate sense of timing, had no intention of pressing her just yet. Raymond Gilliflower, meanwhile, had retreated behind the walls of his sister's house, emerging only once in the early morning to collect the newspaper, his posture hunched, his eyes evasive. It was in many ways a familiar pattern, guilt disguised as grief. But there was more to it, and Miss Marple had learned long ago not to mistake silence for surrender. Something still lay beneath the surface. On the 6th morning after the discovery of the body, a letter arrived, not through the post. It was hand-delivered. Miss Marple found it folded carefully on her front doorstep, weighed down with a smooth stone from the churchyard path. There was no address, only her name on the front in looping, deliberate ink, Miss Jane Marple, personal inside, on thick cream stationery. Dear Miss Marple, you were right about all of it. He killed Victor. I did not know, not until the night after your visit. He told me he was drunk, weeping, shaking. He said it was self-defense, but I saw the watch in his hand. I knew where it had come from, and I remembered the way he looked when he came back that night, as though he had stepped out of a fire. The truth burns, doesn't it? I cannot protect him anymore. I will not. You will know what to do. N.G. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it precisely and set it atop the others in her drawer marked correspondence. Private and serious. There was now no ambiguity. Raymond Gilliflower had killed Victor Lonsdale, likely during a confrontation sparked by blackmail or fear of exposure. Cynthia had unwittingly covered for him, misled by circumstance and her own shame. But now the final confession, even if not from the killer's mouth, had been delivered. Still, Miss Marple had no desire for justice to arrive like a hammer. Truth, she felt, should not be used to destroy but to expose gently, like lifting the edge of wallpaper to see the original design beneath. She rang Colonel Melchett that very afternoon. They had, over the years, developed a rapport, his bluster and procedural instincts tempered by her quiet logic. He arrived within the hour. Well, Jane, he said, settling heavily into her armchair, you've clearly got something, again. Miss Marple passed him the letter. He read it twice, just as she had, then grunted. So the Gilliflower boy did do it. Yes, Miss Marple said, but not in cold blood. I believe it was a clumsy, frightened act. Victor threatened exposure, and Raymond, like many men, chose the most permanent solution to a temporary problem. Melchett grunted again. Damn fool. Quite, said Miss Marple. But Cynthia's involvement complicates things. She thought she was covering her own shame. She didn't know she was shielding a killer. He leaned back, rubbing his mustache. Do you want him arrested? Miss Marple paused. I want him to answer for what he's done. But I also believe in allowing him the chance to speak freely, without force. And for Nora to step out from under the burden of silence. If you confront him directly, he'll deny everything. And she'll crumble. You want me to wait? I want you to come to tea tomorrow. Bring Inspector Craddock quietly. I'll handle the rest. Melchett gave her a long look. You're a dangerous woman, Jane. She smiled sweetly. Not dangerous, Colonel, just persistent. The next afternoon the scene was set. Miss Marple's parlour was warm and filled with the scent of lemon sponge. She had laid out tea for 5, and the good china with the forget-me-nots along the rim made its first appearance of the season. Nora Gilliflower arrived first, as arranged. Her face was drawn, but there was a calm about her, a resignation that suggested she had made peace with whatever was to come. Miss Marple greeted her kindly and gestured to the armchair by the window. You'll find the light pleasant there. Quite soothing. Raymond arrived 10 minutes later, his shoulders hunched, his eyes wary. Miss Marple, he said stiffly. You asked for me? Indeed. And how kind of you to come. Do sit down. They drank tea for several minutes without mention of Victor Lonsdale. The silence was civil, awkward, stretched like a too-tight glove. Then Miss Marple turned her eyes to Raymond and asked, as if in passing, Did you ever think Victor Lonsdale might have changed? Raymond choked slightly on his tea. Changed? From the man he was when he left the country, I don't know. I never expected to see him again. But you did see him, didn't you? Raymond turned pale. No, I mean, yes, briefly, but it was nothing. He came to beg money. I refused. Nora's voice broke in, quiet but firm. You didn't just refuse. Raymond looked at her, startled. You killed him, she said. You struck him with a rock. You left him in the woods, and then you dragged his body to the Pembury house in the middle of the night and hid him in the chimney. Raymond stood. Nora, don't. Miss Marple's voice, gentle as ever, cut in. It's no use, Mr. Gillyflower. Your sister has already told us. And she left this letter. She passed it to him. Raymond read it, then sat down hard, like something had snapped inside him. I didn't mean to kill him, he said, almost childlike. He said he'd ruin us. Said he'd tell everyone about Mother. About the money. Said I'd stolen it. He laughed. Said he'd see to it I was ruined. I hit him, just once. And afterward, Miss Marple prompted, I panicked. I thought if I hit him, no one would know. I didn't think Cynthia would get involved. I didn't expect her to find the body. And the voice? She asked. I didn't hear it. I didn't understand what had happened until they told me about the scream at the chimney. By then it was too late. I thought perhaps the confusion would help me. And now? Raymond looked at Nora. She did not look back. I'll confess, he said, to the inspector. I'll tell them everything. Miss Marple nodded. He's here now, waiting with Colonel Melchett in the next room. There was no protest. Miss Marple poured a fresh cup of tea for Nora, and as the men went into the next room to deliver justice, quiet and procedural, the two women remained. I always knew he wasn't strong, Nora said. Not bitterly, but with a deep, exhausted kind of sorrow. I just never imagined how weak he could be. Miss Marple touched her hand. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do, she said gently, is to stop protecting those who hide behind our love. Nora Gillyflower's hand trembled, but she did not withdraw it. Outside, the roses in the garden stood in full bloom, soft, delicate, and fierce in their quiet, unflinching beauty. The days that followed were curiously still, as though St. Mary Mead were holding its breath in the wake of a confession that had rattled more than just the immediate families involved. Word had not yet travelled in full. Inspector Craddock, at Miss Marple's quiet urging, had ensured the matter was being handled with discretion. For the time being, the official line was that Victor Lonsdale's death had been ruled an accident, pending further inquiry. But among the inner circles of churchgoers and committee ladies, the air buzzed with something subtler than gossip, a shared hush. Miss Marple, of course, kept to her routine. She walked every morning, tended her herb pots, and spent a good deal of time knitting in her parlour, with one eye on the street below. It was a relief in some ways to have the outer facts confirmed. And yet, there remained in the back of her mind a subtle unease. Not doubt precisely. The killer had been revealed, and the confession was genuine. But there was something unfinished about it all. It came to her 2 mornings later, as she passed the churchyard on her way to return a borrowed book to the vicarage. A sparrow darted low across her path, startling her for a moment, and she paused, glancing toward the moss-covered stones, and then toward the rectory gates. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Brinton, was trimming lavender by the gate. She looked up with her usual brisk cheer. Miss Marple, you must come in for a slice of lemon tart. I've made far too much again. Far too much again. Miss Marple smiled and obliged, though she had no particular appetite. She had learned long ago that conversations worth having rarely occurred over empty plates. In the drawing room, over tart and teacups, the conversation drifted, gardening, hymn selections, the upcoming fete. But then, unbidden, Mrs. Brinton said, It's such a tragedy about the Gillyflower boy. I suppose it's always the quiet families that hide the strangest things. People are like teapots, Miss Marple said. The more pressure inside, the more startling the whistle when it comes. Mrs. Brinton nodded, clearly approving. And poor Cynthia Prowse. She hasn't come out once. Caroline says she won't speak above a whisper. I always said she had too much imagination for her own good. Did I tell you what she said to me last month at the book group? She claimed she used to write poetry in secret. Can you imagine? Miss Marple blinked slowly. Did she? I hadn't heard that. Oh yes, said Mrs. Brinton, setting down her fork. Romantic, tragic things, she said. All about lost lovers and shadows and regret. Quite dramatic. She asked if I thought anyone would read her memoirs if she ever wrote them, as if people would pay to read about her life. Miss Marple smiled. but her fingers tensed just slightly around her teacup. "She said that last month?" "Yes, certainly. Just before she had that fainting spell at the post office. I think the heat got to her." But Miss Marple's mind was already drifting away from lemon tart and poetry. The timeline was wrong. Cynthia had claimed, when first questioned, that she hadn't seen Victor Lonsdale in years, that she was startled by his return, that she didn't know he had come to the village until the very day of the tea, and yet she had been speaking about regret, about memoirs, about poetry and lost lovers, weeks before the garden party. Miss Marple's thoughts gathered quickly, knitting together like threads pulling tight in a stitch. She remembered Cynthia's glass of water, untouched, her shaking hands, her uncharacteristic lateness to the tea. Most had assumed her distress came from guilt about past indiscretions or fear of scandal. But perhaps it came from something deeper, not just complicity, not just panic foreknowledge. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Caroline Pembury. The house had settled back into its usual post-tea calm. A faint smell of beeswax lingered from the furniture polish, and the ticking clock in the hallway kept its usual soothing rhythm. Caroline welcomed Miss Marple warmly, though she looked tired. Her eyes darted upstairs when she mentioned Cynthia, who had taken to keeping her bedroom door closed throughout the day. "She barely eats," Caroline said, her voice low. "I tried to bring her soup yesterday and she just stared at it like she didn't know what it was." "Trauma affects people in different ways," Miss Marple said. "But tell me, Caroline, do you remember how Cynthia met Victor?" Caroline blinked. "Met him? Good heavens, I don't know that she ever truly did. Oh, she mentioned him once, years ago. Said he was a friend of George's before we were married. But she was always vague. Back then I assumed she meant someone at university or from the war. Did she ever speak of him recently?" "Before the garden tea," Caroline hesitated. "Well, yes. Now that you mention it, about a week beforehand. She asked me, it was an odd question, whether I believed people could change completely, whether someone could disappear from their past and become something else entirely. I said no, that we are who we are however we try to hide it." Miss Marple nodded. "And how did she take that?" "She seemed shaken, almost afraid. I assumed it was one of her strange moods." "But now," Caroline's voice faltered, "you think she knew he was back even then?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that she may never have lost contact with him at all." She returned home disturbed. It was not simply guilt or misplaced loyalty that kept Cynthia in her bedroom. It was deeper. And now, Miss Marple felt sure of one more thing. Cynthia had seen Victor Lonsdale alive far more recently than she had claimed. Perhaps she had never stopped seeing him. That evening, just as the sun slipped low beyond the hedgerows, Miss Marple paid her final visit to Larkspur Lane. Cynthia Prowse opened the door herself. Her face was pale, her cardigan too large on her thin frame, but she seemed lucid, watchful, resigned. "May I come in?" Miss Marple asked. Cynthia stood aside. In the drawing room they sat together without ceremony. The fire was unlit. The curtains were drawn. "I must ask you something difficult," Miss Marple said gently, "and I would be grateful if you answered honestly." Cynthia said nothing, but her eyes did not look away. "You said you hadn't seen Victor in years, that his reappearance shocked you, but I believe that isn't true. I believe he never quite disappeared. That perhaps he wrote to you, or you to him." Still silence. "I think you loved him once," Miss Marple continued, "and perhaps part of you never stopped. I think you kept his letters, and he kept coming back because you allowed it. And I think on the night before the tea, you arranged to meet him in the woods. Not Raymond, not Nora, you." A long pause. Then Cynthia spoke. "I wrote the telegram," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I asked him to come. I thought he had changed. He said he'd changed. He promised." Her hands twisted in her lap. "But when he arrived, he laughed. He said I was just a place to land when things went wrong. That he needed money. That he would tell Caroline everything unless I helped him." She looked up. "And I did help him. I gave him a brooch, gold, a family piece. I thought it would buy me time. I told him to wait in the woods, that I'd come back with more. But I didn't. I stayed here. And when I returned the next morning, he was gone." Tears slid down her face. "I thought he'd left, that he'd taken the brooch and vanished. I felt relief, but then I heard the voice in the chimney, and I realized he hadn't gone anywhere. You weren't covering Raymond, Miss Marple said softly. You were covering yourself? I didn't kill him, Cynthia whispered, but I let him die. Miss Marple rose and took her hand. Then it is time to stop hiding, my dear. The worst has happened. All that's left is to tell the truth, completely. And Cynthia, after a long, trembling pause, nodded. Inspector Craddock was a man who preferred facts lined up in neat, sensible rows. Motive, opportunity, action. That was how he liked a case to unfold. But what Miss Marple laid before him now was not a straight path, but a winding lane, shadowed by emotion and warped by years of guilt and fragile hope. Two truths, she said gently, as they sat in his office the next morning, both partially concealed. Each woman thinking she was protecting someone else, when in fact they were protecting themselves. Craddock rubbed a hand over his face. Let me see if I've got this straight. Cynthia Prowse and Victor Lonsdale had a relationship years ago, prior to her marriage. They maintained contact secretly for years. Intermittently, Miss Marple said. He was a drifter, a man used to using people and discarding them when it suited him. But Cynthia romanticized him. She believed or wanted to believe that he was her great tragic love. Craddock grimaced. And when he returned, she summoned him, Miss Marple corrected. Wrote to him. Asked him to come. Craddock nodded slowly. Right. So she brings him here, thinks he's reformed, and instead he threatens to reveal their affair to her cousin and perhaps worse. He demanded money, Miss Marple said. She gave him an heirloom brooch to buy him off, told him to wait, promised more. Then she fled. Out of fear, shame, she meant to return, but couldn't. And while he waited, Raymond Gilliflower met him in the woods. Yes, Miss Marple said. Raymond, who also had reason to fear Victor's presence, whether for financial dealings or secrets Victor knew from the past. Perhaps even both. Whatever passed between them, it ended with a blow to the head. Craddock leaned forward. So Cynthia didn't kill him? No, Miss Marple said quietly. But she let him die. She knew the moment the voice called from the chimney that it must be Victor, no one else. And yet she played along. She created the illusion that it had been a stranger, that she had no connection to him at all, which misled the investigation, Craddock said, which wasted time, which let Gilliflower almost get away with it. Yes, Miss Marple said. But consider, Inspector, both confessions emerged not from interrogation, but from conscience. They told the truth because it weighed too heavily. Craddock scowled. That's all very noble, but the law isn't built on conscience, Miss Marple. Gilliflower killed a man. Prowse concealed a death. That's criminal. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed, and I believe both are prepared to face the consequences. But I ask you to consider one thing further. Victor Lonsdale's life, what kind of man he was. Craddock sighed. We've looked into it. Petty crimes, bad debts, a few aliases. He was a drifter, a manipulator. He was a man who left wounds behind, Miss Marple said gently. People like him. They don't murder with knives or guns. They murder with charm and promises they never keep. They make others carry their burdens, sometimes for years. Craddock was quiet for a long moment. Oh, you want leniency? I want understanding, she replied. Standing, she replied. Standing. In the days that followed, the case shifted. Raymond Gilliflower was formally charged with manslaughter. His confession matched evidence recovered from the scene. A single blow, not premeditated in the midst of a panicked confrontation. The Crown prosecutor took into account his immediate confession, once confronted, his lack of prior criminal record, and the volatile history of the victim. Cynthia Prowse was not charged. Her confession, written and spoken, was entered into the official record, but her actions were deemed the result of emotional trauma rather than malice or criminal intent. Her deliberate misdirection had been serious, but her cooperation in uncovering the full truth weighed heavily in her favor. The village, in its fashion, folded the events into the gentle quilt of its collective memory. Mrs. Brinton, over tea, described it as a sad business, but not entirely unexpected. At the grocer's, someone remarked that quiet ones always surprise you. And at the Women's Institute, it was decided with faint awkwardness not to invite Miss Prowse to chair the poetry committee that year. Not just yet, they said, though she has a gift. Miss Marple did not comment. She knew the village would heal in its own time, in its own way, that some people would whisper and others would forget entirely, that Caroline Pembury, bless her, would pretend she had known all along, and that Cynthia would be given quiet dignity, not forgiveness, perhaps, but space to begin again. One afternoon, some weeks later, there came a knock at Miss Marple's door. Cynthia stood there, thinner, pale, her hands clasped together like a girl coming to confess a broken vase. "I hoped," she said, "that I might speak with you." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her inside. "I've just made a fresh pot." They sat in the parlour where the roses bloomed again in the window boxes. "I wanted to say thank you," Cynthia said. "Not just for what you did, but for what you didn't do. You didn't expose me before I was ready." Miss Marple poured her tea. "The truth," she said, "is a thing best spoken willingly. It must come from within, or it only causes more harm." Cynthia nodded. "I still don't know who I was trying to protect. Him, myself, a version of my life that was already gone. Often all three," Miss Marple said. "People carry their illusions like family heirlooms. They're hard to let go even when they've tarnished beyond recognition." Cynthia gave a small, sad smile. "I don't expect the village to welcome me back. Give them time," Miss Marple said, "and show them you haven't crumbled." Cynthia looked up. "You think I haven't?" Miss Marple set her teacup down with a decisive clink. "You're sitting here telling the truth. That is not crumbling. That is building again." They sat in silence for a while after that, the soft tick of the clock filling the room. Outside, a sparrow flitted by the window again, and Miss Marple turned to watch it with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said quietly, "there was once a girl in my village, many years ago, who fell for a travelling actor. Handsome as the day is long. Promised her London, promised her love. He left a week later and sent nothing but a bill for the hotel room." Cynthia looked startled. "And what happened to her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "She became the church organist. Never married, and played the most heartbreaking version of Abide With Me you've ever heard." Cynthia gave a soft laugh. It was the first Miss Marple had heard from her. "Thank you," she said again, rising. Miss Marple walked her to the door. "Be kind to yourself, Cynthia. The world will do its worst without your help." When the door closed, Miss Marple returned to her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The threads of the mystery had now been tied gently but securely. Victor Lonsdale's voice would not echo again, not in chimneys, not in letters, not in fearful memories. He had been heard. He had been answered. And now finally he had been silenced, not by denial, but by truth. As she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the quiet, Miss Marple thought, not of death, but of restoration, and the small, steady work of mending what had come apart. The final act of any village drama, Miss Marple often thought, was not played on the stage or in the courtroom, but in the quiet moments after, the way people glanced at each other in the post-office queue, the small silences that crept into conversation, the manner in which a name was said, or not said at all. In the weeks following Raymond Gillyflower's formal indictment, the rhythms of St. Mary Mead returned, as they always did, to the deceptively peaceful patterns of daily life. But something in the air had changed. A subtle shift. The kind that happens when secrets have been dug up and the earth has not quite settled back in place. At the Women's Institute, the upcoming charity bazaar filled the committee's attention. Banners had to be ironed, trestle tables counted, and no one wanted to sit next to Mrs. Edgecombe, who had taken to inserting bleak comments about sin into even the most innocent conversations about sponge cakes. Miss Marple, who chaired the needlework table this year, remained her usual calm self, smiling politely as Mrs. Edgecombe offered her unsolicited opinion about how all this moral decay started with the short hemline. "It started," Miss Marple said gently, "with fear, not fashion." And then she returned to her embroidery, leaving Mrs. Edgecombe to blink rapidly and pretend she understood. But beneath the surface, a final question still tugged at her thoughts. It had nothing to do with guilt or innocence, nor with whether Raymond would face a judge. He would, or whether Cynthia would recover. She already was, in her own way, piecing herself back together like fine porcelain. No, the question was a quieter one, insistent, half-formed, and entirely in Miss Marple's nature to pursue. Why the chimney? The most dramatic hiding place imaginable. Foolish, risky, bound to be discovered, and so very theatrical. A blow in the woods could have been followed by a burial, a shallow grave, an anonymous path, a disappearance explained away. But someone had gone to the trouble of dragging Victor Lonsdale's body across fields, through a garden gate, and stuffing him into the chimney of a house where a garden tea was to be held the very next day. And Cynthia, Miss Marple now believed, had not fabricated the voice after the body was placed. She had heard it. That voice crying from the chimney, hollow and terrified. What if Victor had still been alive? The thought came to her suddenly one morning, as she tended to the violets in her window box. She dropped her watering can, barely noticing the splash on her shoes. If Victor had not died from Raymond's blow, if he had only been wounded, dazed, unconscious, then everything changed. She retrieved the coroner's report that she had kept among her papers and read it again, slowly this time. The blow to the head had been likely cause of death, but suffocation, carbon monoxide asphyxiation, was also noted, due to residual soot and lack of oxygen in the airways. And then Miss Marple closed her eyes. Victor had not died in the woods. He had died in the chimney. She rang Inspector Craddock at once. He arrived an hour later. "Tie askew a notebook ready. You've got that look again," he said, settling into her parlor chair. "I've had a terrible thought," Miss Marple said, already pouring tea. Victor Lonsdale was still alive when he was hidden in the chimney. Craddock froze. "The coroner's report was inconclusive," she said, "as it often is when two possible causes are present. And the timing, the voice, Cynthia heard it, Inspector. That's why she was so shaken. That's why she invented the story of the prank. She couldn't face what it really was, a dying man calling for help. A man she had left alone." Craddock blinked. "But Raymond, he said Victor was dead when he hid the body." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe he believed that. But Raymond was not a man of steady nerves or great experience." He panicked. He saw Victor motionless, perhaps groaning, bleeding, and assumed the worst. He dragged him away and stuffed him into the chimney. Not to hide a body, Inspector. To hide a crime. To delay discovery. Craddock sat back, shaken. "He didn't mean to kill him." "No," Miss Marple said. "But he did. Not with the rock, but with what came after. And now he must know it." The inspector rubbed his chin. "That'll change things. The charge will still be manslaughter, but the circumstances, well, it's uglier now. More tragic," Miss Marple said quietly. That evening she walked again to Chapel Row. The Gillyflowers house was shuttered now. Raymond was gone, awaiting arraignment. Nora still lived there, though she rarely emerged. Miss Marple knocked gently, and after a long pause the door creaked open. Nora stood in the frame, her face hollowed by sleeplessness. "I know," she said before Miss Marple could speak. "He wasn't dead." Miss Marple nodded. "I found the boots," Nora whispered, "the ones he wore that night. I cleaned them. They were covered in soot. But there was something else. Scratches on the heels, deep ones, like he'd tried to kick his way out." Miss Marple said nothing. "He suffocated in there. My brother killed him twice. Once by fear, once by silence. They stood together for a long time. No police, no accusations. Just two women who understood in different ways the cruelty of a slow death and the quiet tragedy of a life misjudged. I will tell them," Nora said. "I'll give them the boots. The truth." Miss Marple reached forward and took her hand. "That is all we can do." A month later, a quiet service was held at the edge of the churchyard. Victor Lonsdale's body had finally been claimed by a distant cousin from Essex, who'd known him only as a child and come out of obligation, not sentiment. The burial was sparsely attended. No eulogy, no flowers. Miss Marple went, standing alone beneath the yew tree. As the soil hit the coffin lid, she thought, not of who Victor Lonsdale had been, but of the voice. That terrible cry, that echo trapped in brick and soot, "Let me out." 3 words that haunted every lie, every confession. Later that day she walked through the village as if in any ordinary afternoon, nodding to Mrs. Banfield, waving at young Billy Hargreaves. The shops were open. The church bells chimed 4. Everything was as it had been. But Miss Marple, with her soft steps and gentle eyes, had heard the voice in the chimney, and unlike the others, she had answered it. The morning of the harvest festival dawned with a golden mist rising off the fields. The sun filtering through in gentle shafts that lit up the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, like something from a watercolour. It was the sort of day that made the world look innocent again. Baskets of apples and late summer squash lined the church steps, and the scent of marigolds mixed with wood polish inside St. Mary's as the final arrangements were made. Children practiced their hymns under the watchful eye of Mrs. Brinton, and Reverend Chiswell dusted his cassock for the third time. Miss Marple arrived just before 10, gloved, hatted, and utterly serene. She took her usual pew, third row from the front, left-hand side, good acoustics and perfect visibility. From there she could see everyone. The villagers had come out in full. The vicar's wife in lavender. Mr. Sims, the constable, trying to look more serious than his years allowed. Mrs. Edgecombe with a tight bun and tighter smile, and even Caroline Pembury, who had resumed her social duties with determined briskness. But 2 pews ahead, a quiet gap stood out. Cynthia Prowse's seat. Empty. Miss Marple didn't frown. She rarely did, but her expression shifted, just slightly. Cynthia had begun, in recent weeks, to reappear about the village, at the grocer's, at the post office, even once hesitantly at the Women's Institute, never speaking much but smiling, reclaiming in cautious steps the life she had nearly abandoned, but not today. The choir began its hymn, and Miss Marple allowed herself to be carried with it, the old words a balm to a village soul still healing. It was later that afternoon, while pruning her rose arch, that the knock came at her garden gate. Miss Marple turned, secateurs in hand. Cynthia stood there, wrapped in a pale grey shawl, a straw hat drooping over her face. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, her voice almost shy. "Not in the slightest," Miss Marple replied, motioning her in. "I was just thinking these roses would do well with a bit less show and a bit more strength. Something I suspect you understand." Cynthia managed a ghost of a smile. "I didn't go to the service," she said, stepping lightly through the garden, her fingers brushing the rosemary as she passed. "I thought about it, even put my gloves on, but I couldn't make myself step inside." "You'll know when it's time," Miss Marple said. "The door won't shut." Cynthia sank into the garden chair Miss Marple kept beneath the clematis trellis. The breeze stirred her shawl like a curtain. "They've reduced the charge," she said. "Raymond, voluntary manslaughter. He pleaded guilty." Miss Marple nodded. "I thought he might. He wrote me a letter. From custody." Cynthia looked away into the climbing ivy. "He said he was sorry, not just for what happened, but for not trusting anyone enough to tell the truth sooner. Said he had spent too long hiding behind the version of himself he wished he were." Miss Marple plucked a dead leaf from the rose bush. "A common ailment. Men are rarely taught to endure self-discovery." Cynthia didn't laugh, but she exhaled as if she might have wanted to. "I still think about Victor," she said quietly. "About that moment in the woods. I see it again and again, the look on his face. Not angry, not pleading, just tired." Miss Marple nodded. "Some men live like shadows, Cynthia. They take warmth from others and leave them cold in return. You did not kill him, but you did love him longer than he deserved. That's what I struggle with," Cynthia said, "the part of me that still wanted it to be real, even as I watched it fall apart." Miss Marple reached over and gently touched her hand. "Regret," she said, "is not shame. It is a sign that you have begun to tell the truth to yourself. That is where healing begins." Cynthia sat still for a moment. Then she looked up, her eyes steadier than Miss Marple had yet seen them. "I've decided to go away for a while," she said. "Not to flee, just to rest. I have cousins in Devon. I think I might walk the coast." "A wise choice," Miss Marple said. "Sea air clears more than just the lungs." "I'll come back," Cynthia said. "When I've forgiven myself," Miss Marple smiled. "The village will wait." That evening the golden mist returned, blanketing the thatched rooftops of St. Mary Mead as twilight deepened. Miss Marple sat by her front window, her tea cooling beside her, her knitting forgotten on her lap. She watched as the lights came on in the windows across the street. She knew each household well. The Pemburys now quiet again, young Mr. Sims reading by the lamp, Mrs. Banfield in her usual armchair, her cat on her lap. Familiar silhouettes framed by domesticity. But behind those windows stories had unfolded. Lies had been told. Fear had gripped, then released. And yet, the village endured. She thought of Victor Lonsdale, not as a body in a chimney, not as a voice echoing down brick walls, but as a man who had stumbled through life causing others to stumble too. He had not meant to die in St. Mary Mead. He had not expected his presence to unravel so many lives, but sometimes Miss Marple knew that was how evil worked, not as a monstrous act, but as a series of selfish choices, none large enough to set off alarms, until someone was broken under the weight of them. And in the end, it had not been poison or daggers or locked rooms that solved the case. It had been listening, to silences, to contradictions, to a voice in a chimney no one else believed was real, a soft sound. Half lost in a summer breeze, she reached for her knitting again. Outside, the village settled into evening, the roads empty, the gardens at rest. Somewhere a dog barked once and then quieted, and Miss Marple, gentle guardian of truth and shadows, clicked her needles together once more, stitch by stitch, memory by memory, until the fabric of the world was mended again, for now. It was nearly dusk on a Tuesday when Miss Marple received the final letter. The envelope bore a London postmark. The handwriting was unfamiliar, crisp, educated, but something about the restraint of it gave her pause. She opened it without haste, setting her teacup aside, and unfolded the sheet within. Dear Miss Marple, my name is Francis Lonsdale. I am Victor's brother. We were estranged for many years. He burned many bridges, including ours, but I was informed through official channels of his death, and your name was mentioned in connection with the case. I wanted to thank you, not because my brother died, but because you ensured the truth followed him into the grave. He was not an innocent man, but he was still a man, and someone needed to see him clearly for better or worse. You did that, and in doing so, you gave him what he never managed to find for himself, an ending. I enclose something that may belong to a Miss Cynthia Prowse. It was among Victor's things when he died, a small brooch. I suspect it has a story of its own. Yours sincerely, Francis Lonsdale. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and examined the object that had come with it, wrapped in soft paper, nestled in tissue like a relic. It was a gold brooch, modest and old-fashioned, shaped like a swallow in flight. A delicate thing, no larger than a thumb, but with detail that revealed the craftsmanship of another age. Miss Marple held it gently, remembering Cynthia's shame, Victor's promise, the false hope that led to real tragedy. Later that afternoon, she walked to Larkspur Lane. Caroline Pembury answered the door, surprised but smiling. "Jane, what a lovely surprise." "Come in. No, do come in." "Just for a moment," Miss Marple said. "Is Cynthia still here?" "She is, though she's leaving in the morning." "Devon, did she tell you?" "A cousin near the coast." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought this might reach her before she goes." She handed over the brooch, still wrapped. Caroline took it, frowning, then understanding dawning in her eyes. "It's hers," she said quietly. "I remember it. She wore it all the time when we were girls. She told me it was her mother's." "I believe she gave it away," Miss Marple said gently, in a moment of weakness. "And now it has returned." Caroline hesitated. "Do you think it will help?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that sometimes when you've lost something you gave up in fear, having it returned helps you forgive the person you were." Caroline nodded slowly. "I'll give it to her now." Miss Marple declined tea this time. She left as quietly as she had come. The train station at Much Benham was unusually quiet the next morning. The train to Devon hissed gently on its track, the smoke curling upward like soft ribbon. Cynthia stood alone on the platform, her luggage modest, her hat tilted slightly against the light breeze. She turned when she heard the soft click of shoes on stone. Miss Marple smiled. "I thought I might see you off." Cynthia looked touched. "Thank you," she said. "It means more than I can say." "I brought you something," Miss Marple said. Well, Francis Lonsdale did, in truth. Victor's brother. She handed her the brooch. Cynthia's breath caught. "Oh," she whispered. "I thought it was gone forever." Miss Marple nodded. "Most things aren't, really. They just go where they're least expected." Cynthia's eyes filled, but she smiled even through it. "Thank you. Write when you feel ready," Miss Marple said. "Or not at all. The village will remember you with grace if you give it time," the conductor called, and Cynthia embraced her gently. And then she boarded the train. Miss Marple watched until it vanished down the track, a ribbon of smoke trailing behind like the tail of a dream. Back in St. Mary Mead, The season turned. The Michaelmas daisies bloomed pale violet along the hedges. Apples were pressed into cider. Children returned to school, their satchels bumping behind them. And life, as always, bent gently back into its familiar shapes. At the next meeting of the Women's Institute, there was a new addition to the library fund and a spirited debate over the color scheme for the hall bunting. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual chair near the piano, listened politely, knitting steadily. Someone remarked in passing that the vicar had quoted Wordsworth in his last sermon and that it had been rather too melancholy for a Sunday. Miss Marple smiled. When the meeting ended, she stepped outside into the autumn air. A robin chirped from a nearby branch. The light was soft, the wind crisp. St. Mary Mead looked as it always had, and yet beneath its surface, another secret had come and gone. Another heart had broken and begun to heal. Another crime had unfolded, not in shadows and violence, but in whispered regret and quiet choices. She knew more would come. They always did. But for now she would walk home, put the kettle on, and finish her latest pair of gloves, because that too was the work of a detective, to see, to listen, to mend, stitch by stitch, truth by truth, until even the quietest voice in the chimney had been heard.